Is High Speed 2 under threat? Unions say they'll defy new strike laws. And do we need a Minister for Men? This is Politics Live. With me today, former First Secretary of State Damien Green, former General Secretary of the TUC and now a Labour peer, Francis O'Grady, comedian and author Jeff Norcott, and Politics Joe's political correspondent Ava Santina. Today, is the government going wobbly on HS2?
This kind of speculation that people are, making is not right. I mean, we've got spades in the ground, we're getting on and delivering, but across the north, what we're also doing is connecting up all the towns and cities.
Why should the public here always be treated as second-class citizens when it comes to transport?
The government's introduced new laws on strikes. Unions are looking at ways of not complying. We'll ask the former boss of the TUC what that means. And Manchester's new buses come back into public control. Will they be run any better?
We want a bus service. We don't want to just get the companies making loads of money out of it.
Let's stick with transport. Show you this headline in The Times. Osborne, that's George Osborne, the former Conservative Chancellor, rails against scrapping HS2 line. Yes, well, he is part of the backlash, criticism that is growing over the possible scrapping of the HS2 high-speed rail link between Birmingham and Manchester. And my question to open the programme to the panel, starting with you, Damien, is should the government scrap it?
Well, if it's completely unaffordable, yes. But, I mean, I'm, as many people are, sort of emotionally in favour, both of Grand Projet generally, and also this one, because I think levelling up is very important. There does, of course, come a point where you just say, this does not stack up. We are not getting any value for money. And we may be there or not. I don't know. The decision clearly hasn't been taken yet.
Right. Hedging your bets a little bit there. On balance, should they scrap it or not?
Well, I don't know, because I don't know the figures. I mean, that's what they're looking at. And I think, as I say, if you ask me purely emotionally, I applaud these kind of projects. But you have to live in the real world.
Francis, should it be scrapped?
No. In what world does it make sense to have an HS2 that doesn't start in Leeds and Manchester and ends at Wormwood Scrubs? We've invested. There are real gains to be made in terms of the infrastructure, our ailing railway structure, jobs, apprenticeships, the green agenda. What we do need is more east-west in the north, in the same way you get it in the south. And I think that's something that, we heard Andy Burnham saying very clearly. It mustn't be either or for the north. But if this country is going to grow its economy again, we have got to invest.
Should it be scrapped?
Well, I think with HS2, I remember when Eurostar was coming into view, people were counting the sleeps. We were excited about this cross-channel link. I don't think anyone's been doing the same for getting to Manchester half an hour quicker. I don't know if the public are that exercised about it. So, in a way, it could be a bold move by Sunak, but a lot of it would depend on what the money's redeployed to do. Could it be for a tax cut? Probably not with this government, the direction that they're in. Could it be to sort of improve transport links across the country?
Well, that's the idea,
as Francis quite correctly says, we've got this weird obsession in this country with up and down. Everything's up and down. But what about the side to side? A lot of us need to go side to side, east to west. So I suppose politically, how this plays out, a lot of it will be about the framing. If you said we're not going to spend it on that because the costs have exponentially mushroomed, but we are going to improve transport across the country, I don't think it's necessarily an absolute disaster.
Ava?
Well, I just don't think they will. That's the problem. I mean, we've had how long? 20 years of lack of investment in the rails. I think that the only reason that he's looking, or Sunak is looking to scrap this, is because he's approaching an election and he's realised that actually he can't finish it on time. So it's better to scrap it and tell the public, I'm saving you a load of money and I'm going to invest in local public transport projects, than it is to fail.
Andy Burnham, who is the Mayor of Greater Manchester, we saw him there in the headlines, says it's going to, axing that extension, will risk creating a north-south divide beyond anything we've imagined now. And when you think about the benefit to your constituency in terms of infrastructure with HS1 in the south, don't you think they just deserve it, whatever the cost?
Well, I think it's whatever the cost. That sums it up exactly. There are hugely desirable things you would want to do, but you can't do things whatever the cost, because you have to take that money either out of people's pockets or out of other projects. And I take the point, actually, that I think if you had asked northern political leaders what's most urgent, they would have said lines east-west, the sort of Liverpool, Manchester...
but Andy Burnham isn't saying that. He's saying this extension is absolutely vital.
Andy Burnham is saying, what do we want everything, when do we want it now? And I think that's a bit unrealistic. I think the serious point that the country needs to address, and this goes back decades, is why are we so bad at big long-term projects? Norway can finish an infrastructure project in the time it takes us to get through the design phase, and there's really serious issues there.
Right, I mean, your view is clear. Should the Labour Party now commit to that extension?
I think Labour has said, understandably, we need to see what the government's going to do.
Well, then that isn't
whether
clear,
there's
is
a
it?
hole in the project
Why?
before we make a decision,
Well, hang
because
on.
they have to look at the books.
Well, except
But
that Labour's happy
one-
to make spending commitments on things like £28 billion worth of investment in climate change policies. Why not commit that now
Because
to
I
this?
think one of the questions that we do have to ask is why have, under the Conservative government, why have we had ballooning costs on this project? You know, there's only been one government in charge. There's been a revolving door, by the way, of transport secretaries, business
But do you think the
secretaries.
government want it to cost more? I mean, these are about
I
quotes,
think
these are about
nobody
the
was
cost of
being held
materials,
to
about labour.
account for those ballooning costs. I think they do a game of musical chairs where they pass the buck to the next Secretary of State, and nobody is ever held to account for doing a job. And I think more and more people are fed up of having speeches from politicians. We want to see politicians actually run stuff and deliver it.
Damien?
The problem with planning big projects well predates this government. It does go back decades. We were holding royal commissions on this in the 1960s. And a lot of it is to do with the planning system and the sort of natural impulse to try and be as democratic as possible, to consult everyone as much as possible. And that means you can never easily express a national priority. We can do it occasionally. We did it for the Olympics. That was a big infrastructure project. And you know what? There was a deadline, and Britain's reputation around the world depended on it. And we built those Olympic facilities on time, so we could do it for other projects.
Right, I mean, there isn't a decision yet. It is speculation. And, of course, the Conservative Party conference is being held, yes, in Manchester. What's this going to do, Ava, in terms of Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister's claim and pledge to make decisions for the long term?
I think it's going to play quite well into his hands, actually, because he's sort of been weaponising car use over the past couple of weeks. We had this big pledge for net zero and, electric cars by 2035. That was moved to 2030. He can now make the argument that the country is simply not ready to give up their petrol and diesel cars, and it's only the eco-fanatics who want you to get onto the trains, when actually covering up the fact that he's simply not invested in rail for too long of a time.
All right.
Do you think, maybe I'm being really cynical here, but they've probably been party to these leaks that it might be getting cancelled, and lo and behold, he's in Manchester soon, and he stands on stage and bangs the desk and goes, I can commit now to HS2 going to Manchester.
Well,
is this a little bit?
He might change his mind.
Was this a little bit of a
Let's
bait and
hope
switch?
so.
Because I mean, it would be straight out of the political playbook.
Well, let's see if you're proven right. We don't have to wait too long.
Voters won't be keen on being messed around like that in the north.
You're giving him ideas as well. He might take them. He might see that as a good
Remember
idea.
where you heard it here first on Politics Live. Let's have a look at this headline in the Daily Telegraph. NHS strikes forced cancellation of more than 1 million appointments, figures expected to show. Junior doctors, of course, have been striking over pay. They've been joined by consultants. Both groups went on strike last week, and we are expecting more disruption. Francis, what do you say to all those patients who have had their appointments cancelled, maybe not once, twice, but 3 times? Isn't it just time to stop the strikes and for these striking doctors to go back to work?
Well, isn't it time for ministers to get back in the room with the unions and start negotiating? I mean, instead of sorting out the mess that is the NHS with record waiting lists, 130,000 vacancies, they are picking a fight with doctors and nurses and saying they'll sack them if they refuse to cross a picket line.
Well, hang on, we're conflating... I mean, that's true, but we're conflating 2 slightly different issues. We're going to come on to the laws in a moment. But just on a basic level, over the pay, the demands by junior doctors, they have asked for pay restoration of up to 35%. When you say picking a fight, should they go back to work because of the consequences on patients?
They need a deal. They need a deal. And what's more, I think the vast majority of patients support staff in the NHS, because after all, we were all out on the doorstep clapping them when they were working, you know, ungodly shifts during COVID. We thank them for their work, and I think most of us believe they should be rewarded fairly for it. And the only way you're going to come to a fair deal is negotiating. You can't have ministers hiding away from the people that only, you know, a couple of years ago we were thanking.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a failure of government, this, isn't it? It's a failure of ministers, of statecraft at every level to actually bring an end to these strikes.
You can't bring an end to a strike. It takes two people to strike a deal. And the fact is the government, I mean, Francis said that the government's fighting a war with doctors and nurses. Nurses have settled, like teachers have settled. There was a good pay deal on offer. There is a good pay deal on offer, which nurses have accepted, which doctors haven't. Consultants haven't. Consultants are among the top 2-3% earners in this country. It is extraordinary for them to be on strike over pay.
Exactly.
And I think, I think
how did it come to this?
Well, but the leadership of the
BMA
BMA is letting down a lot of its members.
Well, and is this the answer then, having these minimum service laws? If you have a look at this in The Guardian, the TUC, where Francis was before, agrees non-compliant strategy against anti-strike laws, which could, they say, result in people being sacked unfairly. Minimum service levels for a minister to decide what they should be. Has that had the desired response?
After consultation, the idea that this is somehow out of kilter with what they do in other countries is just complete nonsense.
It is out of kilter.
France, Spain and Italy have minimum service levels.
That is out of kilter. We have some of the most draconian strike laws in the whole of Western Europe. I mean, we're second to Russia. I mean, that's completely wrong.
This particular proposal that the TUC voted against is the same as proposals in other big European countries.
Don't do it. We'll come to that, because I've got the examples of France.
One more sentence. Insisting that people can't get cancer treatment or dialysis doesn't seem to be a very good place, candidly, for the trade union movement to put itself in.
In other countries, you cannot sack workers for refusing to cross a
But in Spain, actually, you can't go on strike in many of these sectors.
But
like the
in
police
terms of
in this
minimum
country.
service levels, they are negotiated. There is collective bargaining. Because in the end, you can't just boss people
this Act does.
when they feel they're being treated unjustly.
I think
you have to come to an agreement, a mature
I think there is
agreement.
a problem. I mean, if you're saying that it should be at the discretion of ministers, if you look at the, should we say, healthy turnover of Conservative ministers in the last few years, you've got a lot of people in the role that aren't there very long and are quite new to the job. But then I think, again, if you look at this from the public's point of view, if you talk about minimum service levels in health, I think most people would expect that to exist. Fire service, education, decommissioning of nuclear materials. That sounds like an area where we might want to have some sort of minimum service level. So it could be.
Hang on.
It could be
on a
though,
voluntary basis.
on a political level, it could be a wedge issue for Labour at some point, because I guess they've said, haven't they, that they're going to row back on this
They're going to repeal.
in the first 100
Labour will.
days.
They are. They're
Fair
committed
enough.
to.
And that's a reasonable position for a sort of supposedly left-wing
Right.
party. But what happens when the Tories are then able to say, do you not want people to put out fires? Do you not want people to attend crimes? It could become a wedge issue.
Right, and Francis, answer the question about what non-compliance actually means. You were General Secretary of the TUC, and now this is what's being advocated. What would that look like?
Well, the trade union movement's been put in a catch-22 situation here, because we've got a law where none of us have seen the detail. The regulations haven't been published. It's all in the hands of the Secretary of State. Nobody knows what minimum service levels will be.
Well,
and we also know, because our committees, including, of course, in the House of Lords, have said that this is likely to be in breach of international law.
But on that,
So
what's non-compliant? But what people will want to know
position.
is, what are unions going to advise their members to do, to defy the law?
Well, I think the TUC has already been very clear. It's not going to be advising anybody to break the law.
Well, what does it mean then?
Well, what it will be doing, once we get the regulations, is convening a special Congress, is looking at what is the strategy going to be, because this law is unjust, it's unworkable, and it's probably in breach of international law, which affects, by the way, our trade agreements, because labour standards are written into those agreements with Europe, the agreement we want with the United States, and if we're in breach of those, that's a problem for all all of us. So it's a mess, and it's the government that has got us here.
Well, what do you say in response? Because Matt Rack, who is the new president of the TUC, has said he is prepared to look at things like defying the law if this actually goes ahead. And just to explain, it would allow public sector employers to establish minimum service levels on strike days. It would allow employers in sectors like health and transport to issue work notices in advance of industrial action, specifying which staff are needed to ensure a minimum service. And the TUC motion, which has just been passed, commits unions to holding the Congress that Francis has been talking about to explore options which would include defying the law. How would the government respond?
Well, the government would enforce the law, because the law should be enforced. We live in a law-abiding society, and if Parliament has passed a law, then people should obey it. And if we start saying that's not what's going to happen, then chaos ensues. And also, the public will think that if we can't get fires put out, as Jeff has said, then something has gone wrong here.
Right. Well, do you support... Matt Rack described it as a message of defiance to the government, signalling that this government's nasty authoritarian agenda will be vigorously opposed by the trade union movement. And Mick Lynch has said, we're fighting this and we're going to turn this legislation over. Do you support any move to defy the law?
I think we'll see what the members say. But what I'm clear about...
What about you? You were the General Secretary of the TUC. Is this responsible?
What's responsible is to resist as far as possible these laws which are unjust. Can I just say, because I think what not just union leaders but members feel really sore about is that in health, in the fire service, in many other sectors, we already have voluntary minimum service levels agreements for strike days, because where safety is genuinely at risk, then the last thing dedicated staff want to do is put that at risk. They feel insulted and they want to know that there are going to be minimum service levels on non-strike days, because it's this government that's got us into a situation where we've got record waiting lists for the NHS.
I mean, isn't this just going to escalate things?
Well, I think that a lot of these striking people who are on strike have enjoyed reasonably decent support from the public. I do think when you look at the figures of these NHS appointments, what will happen is that there will be sort of ripple effect consequences for that, and that may start to change over the time. And I think when you talk about voluntary minimum standards, that is quite subjective in many terms, in many ways just as subjective as some minister who's just arrived in the job deciding what those are as his discretion. I think what the public would like to see is it enshrined in legislation to some degree. I do think the government need to nail down what those things are, and at which point I think the ball will be in the union's court, and it will be then that the public will judge whether or not their position is reasonable.
I mean, there are minimum service level agreements in other countries, but they do differ. You're absolutely right, Ava, but they are in place in a way that they haven't been here to a certain extent, both in France, Italy and also in Spain, where, as I said, striking is actually prohibited in strategic sectors, but also that there is dialogue between the unions and employers and employees about how they should be enforced. Is this so different?
Yes, it is, actually. And I think, the simple result for this would be for the government minister, the relevant minister, actually meet with the union and resolve the negotiation. I mean, so far, the RMT dispute has cost £1.5 billion. That's what the RMT estimates it's cost the country. The BMA, it's cost £1 billion. Now, both of those figures, you could settle the dispute for a fraction of that cost. But because ministers have been unwilling to even a little bit cave, a little bit negotiate, that's why they've gone on for so long.
Damien?
Well, I think, both in the case of the RMT and the BMA, I'm afraid these strikes are increasingly political. It's particularly true of the RMT. Choosing the ASLEF striking deliberately on the day people are travelling to the Conservative Party conference and the day they're travelling back from the Conservative Party conference. You couldn't wave a bigger flag saying, we are just doing political strikes.
Can I just say that dispute, that one which is twinned with the RMT, that is specifically about conditions and safety. It's about ticket office closures. It's not to do with pay. The RMT side of that strike is not to do with pay.
So the ASLEF, there's no pay component to
the ASLEF is. The RMT side of that is not.
The ASLEF strike I was talking
questioning
about.
that they've conducted a lawful ballot, are you?
No, I didn't say they were breaking law. I'm just saying they're acting politically.
It has to be a legitimate industrial issue, and they've conducted a ballot that's had huge support. There's a real sense that our railways are under pressure with ticket office closures that passengers don't want to see.
No constituent wants to see their ticket office closed.
Do you think
fares rising?
Can you sit there and say they're not politically timed or politically motivated in any way, these strikes?
The union will make its own tactical decisions based on what is most likely to win our members a fair deal, whether that's jobs, conditions, or in the case of NHS staff, pay, because you also can't ignore the fact that after 13 years of Conservative government, people's real pay is worse off than it was before the financial crash. That's the fact.
Jamie?
And you've got to deal with the root cause.
We know, we've
not
seen,
the
I haven't
symptoms.
got the graph here today, but we've used it many, many times to see how pay has stagnated over the period of Conservative government.
Yeah, and it's over the period of the financial crash, a pandemic, and a European war that's driven up energy and food prices. So,
what's the government's plan?
Well, it's not the government's fault that there was a pandemic.
It's
or
never the
that
government's fault.
Well, yeah, but very specifically, I mean,
Apparently.
to blame the government for COVID and to blame the government for the war in Ukraine is a bit
It's about
much.
priorities, and
The
it's
US
about
only has
choices.
3% inflation, and they had all of the global quote-unquote headwinds.
Yeah,
that we
no,
had.
inflation is a reasonable point, and I'm very glad it's coming down. I'm very glad it's the government's top priority, because without bringing inflation down, you don't get any of the growth we need that would actually melt away a lot of these problems, and that's why that's a key priority.
Growth, apart from
Would there be
Mexico.
fewer strike days if Labour wins next year?
I think Labour's track record is that there's never been a national strike in
But do you
public
think
services.
in
and
the
I think that's
situation we're in,
partly-
if Labour wins next year, do you think there will be far fewer strike days?
I think, I tell you what, in my experience as a trade union officer, respect goes an awful long way. And if you're prepared to sit around a table with people, come up with a long-term plan. You can come up with multi-year deals. You can come up with better conditions, action on workloads, as well as pay.
All right.
You know, you can come to a deal if you're shown respect.
Let's talk about the buses, because they are back in public control in Greater Manchester. Reporter Jim Connolly has been out in Manchester and Leeds talking to people about their experiences on the buses.
Sometimes it can be a bit late, so sometimes it's just best to go like 5-10 minutes early to your bus stop and pray it comes on time.
Do you not think that's wasting quite a lot of your day?
What would I spend it doing anyway?
Right, we're in Armley, just on the outskirts of the city centre in Leeds. The idea being to find out what people make of the buses. We're going to see if we can grab a few now. Are you going shopping?
I'm going to airport, Manchester Airport, so I'm just going to get the bus there.
And how reliable do you think the buses are from here?
Not very good, to be honest.
Describe
I'm just
that to us.
checking Google Maps.
Do you normally catch the bus?
No, I normally walk because they never turn up. Normally it says they're due, and then it always skips longer times, and then sometimes it just never turns up. I had to get the bus more if they were more consistent, like turning up every single time. But half the time you go for a bus and sometimes it's like 20 minutes.
First, which runs buses from this stop, told us it's been working closely with one of their technology partners to solve the issue and expects a solution very soon. Clearly, the reliability of information people are getting is a big issue. So we're going to head now to meet Matty, a driver in Hebden Bridge who may have a solution. He gives passengers on his bus a really personal service. Matty, how you doing, mate? You all right?
Not bad, yeah.
Thanks for having us on your bus.
Hiya.
Talk us through your local Facebook group. What is it you do?
It was me and another colleague. Instead of us posting on loads of local community pages, we decided to just set one up, just so everyone can join it and they know exactly what's going on. You know, they can post a question on where's the so-and-so bus, where is it, and we can just tell them.
Without this bus and without the updates from people like Matty, would you feel quite trapped up there?
Yeah, because it's quite isolated if you've got problems, mobility problems.
Yeah.
Especially all the elderly, you know. So it's a really excellent little service.
So what are you heading into town for now?
A few beers.
Do you think bigger bus companies could do similar, or do you think it's probably just a bit of a Hebden thing?
I'm not sure. I feel like you could do it, but only in small areas. I feel like in cities where the bus was sort of bigger, it wouldn't be able to like do that as well.
Matty says he came up with the idea when he was on leave.
I were on holiday in Malta, having a nice time, and I looked at my phone. I had people messaging me asking where the bus is. I'm like, I don't know, Then obviously after that we started doing the page on Facebook, and everything's gone a bit more better for people.
Yeah, there's a personalised service and then there's a personalised service, isn't there?
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
To be honest, that's a pretty small operator, meaning Matty can easily update people. Very different to a big city, like where we're heading now. This is Lee in Greater Manchester, one of the first places in the region where buses are coming back into public control.
I think you kind of connect the idea of kind of like the red London buses, so you've got the yellow Manchester buses. I think that's quite a nice thing to have.
I think it's a good idea.
Some people would argue that ultimately non-bus users are going to end up subsidising your bus journey, and that's not really fair.
We want a bus service. We don't want to just pick companies making loads of money out of it and only picking the routes that they want.
Tell us where you're heading today.
For my mother's having cataracts moved.
Oh, right, OK. It's an eye operation, right. Yeah. You've had to build any extra time into your day because of the buses?
We've had to come out early.
Have you?
Yeah, because we don't know if buses go to turn up or not.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're a bit iffy at the moment.
As long as the bus turns up when I want it, anybody can run service. As long as I get a bus when I want one.
Aren't they marvellous, those bus users? Would buses be better, all of them, under public control and public ownership in the way the B network is now?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because public ownership of transport is actually something that polls very well with Conservative voters. It's not just a left-right thing. It's generally very popular. I think even the mighty Grant Shapps said that he hoped that this worked. Himself, Grant wanted it to work. So I think that it will be popular. The rollout of it will be popular. There is a question about this in the long term, is how it's funded, because I understand that a lot of the money to sort of get this going was from a one-off pot. So there might be a case that what Andy Burnham's done here will play out very well. It's yellow, people seem to like that. It's called the B bus. It's the branding. It's all excellent, you know. And I think Burnham, he's done it. It's been a hard thing. It's been a hard slog through the courts to do this. The things that he has to do down the line to fund it might be where the difficulties come. But I guess from the public's point of view, they might think that even if it does cost them a bit more in terms of business rates, council tax, they might just withstand that if it works.
Will it be better though, Damien?
It's got to be better. What they have is an absolute mess. I mean, you look at the number of services, the amount of different fares, the amount of different contractors. There's a lot of Wild West up there.
So public ownership would be better, won't it?
It might be. It might not be. We don't know. I mean, I think the most profound thing was said by the last lady on the report, who said, "I don't care who runs it as long as the buses come," which is exactly right. And the previous question was also quite fun. Somebody's got to pay for it. Bus services are in most of the country, they're not in some big cities, are privately run, but they're all quite heavily subsidised by taxpayers through local government. So the taxpayer's already paying for quite a lot. The taxpayer will end up presumably paying for all of it in Manchester. It might be better, it might not be.
Well, that's the key, isn't it? It is about who's subsidising it and to the tune of how much.
Well, we were told in the 80s when the Thatcher government deregulated the buses that it would be cheaper fares and more investment, and obviously what happened was the absolute opposite, bus fares rising at double the rate of wages. But there is a problem. This is about control, not about ownership, because the government has barred local government from taking ownership of buses, and I think that's the next step. I think it's an important first step, re-regulation.
Yes, I mean, I think there'll be a transport for Greater Manchester, won't there?
Yeah,
in the way there is in London.
And I think
but you would like full public ownership.
Well, I think that should be on the table, because at the moment money's being taken out of the system into profits that could be used for investment in more electric buses and cheaper fares. So, let's be even more ambitious, and Labour is committed to getting rid of that rule that prevents local government owning.
Damien, would that be a good idea?
It's a question of where you get the capital from, the big sums that you need. I mean, buses are obviously less capital-intensive, capital-demanding than railways,
and
but you still need to buy
buses.
new buses. And if you're saying we're going to eliminate all private sector money, then that means all that capital has got to come from taxpayers as well, and they may start objecting to that.
I mean, it's a case of being run better, but also that the fares would be cheaper, Ava, because actually a single bus fare on the B network, this network in Greater Manchester, is £2. A London single bus fare is £1.75, and the government's capped the bus fares outside of London at £2 until the end of October. Shouldn't it be even cheaper?
Yeah, I mean, well, outside London, about 40% of the bus revenue is public money. So that's 60%. A lot of that has got to go to profit as well. If you can eliminate that profit margin in there, then yes, you can bring the bus fares down. I just think we should nationalise the entire network, and I think it would be a really good thing for Labour to get behind.
I mean, it's funny at the moment. There's never been more support for like solid left-wing policies. It's not where I am politically, but you can see that the support's there. And in every respect, Starmer administration seems to be tiptoeing away from these things. Yeah. Things that have big support, things that he actually committed to 3 years ago. I find it odd politically.
Labour's committed to allowing local government to own. I think that's a big step forward. I think it'll take time to roll out, but it's got to be better value for money for customers, and also also having an integrated approach. The other good thing that Andy Burnham is doing is integrating the buses with trams, with rail. That will make a big difference to productivity and the economy in Greater Manchester. That's a good thing for all of us.
And you've talked about public ownership, but is Labour under Keir Starmer tiptoeing away, as has just been said, away from nationalising other vital industries?
There's been absolute clear commitments to bringing back the railways. As those franchises come up, they'll come back into public control. There's also a commitment to British Energy, which again I think is a big first step, because you know, people aren't stupid. We can see that we've all been ripped off and robbed by water privatisation, energy privatisation and rail privatisation. It won't happen overnight, in my view. I'm a pragmatic person, but what you need to do is be clear about the direction of travel.
Damien?
I think it may be an age thing, but anyone who can remember the nationalised industries and the nationalised transport that we used to have will remember that British Rail was a national joke, that we were very bad at most of the other things we did. And the idea, people on the whole hold government in some contempt. The idea that the government should not only do what it does now, but should do a lot more and should run the commanding heights of the economy.
Because TfL Rail is nationalised and that goes right outside of London, and that's one of the best rail networks that we have in the country. I mean, at the moment, if you want to get on a train outside of a strike day, I'm not including strike days, it's likely going to be a rail replacement bus, or it's going to be so overcrowded that you can't sit down. So privatisation is not really working either.
I don't think arguing that Tory ministers are useless is a great platform for saying we can't bring back
I'm saying the
public
state
ownership.
is useless at running commercial activities.
I think what Burnham might have happened upon here is quite a workable model, in my view, is that you have some sort of private enterprise involved in there. A reasonable compromise between two things. I'd certainly be cautious about complete kind of nationalisation of all transport.
But would you like to see other parts of the country? I mean, regional mayors in places like Leeds and West Yorkshire and Liverpool City region have indicated they want to do the same.
I think it makes sense.
In Manchester.
Yeah, I think it might. Well, listen, a lot of it will depend on how successful this is, and then will people still feel the same way if in 3 years, you know, there's an expensive congestion charge in Manchester or some other long-term funding solution? Because Burnham said that ULEZ wouldn't work because over time ULEZ would be projected to disappear as the air gets cleaner. So I don't think he's yet solved how it will be funded yet.
Right. I mean, in terms of more money going into bus services generally, £300 million has been committed to save bus routes, and that will then encourage more people back onto the buses if the fares come down. Is that a good use of money?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, if people want to travel on buses, then you need the buses there for them to do so. So I think that is a good use of money, and that is a good.
Should it be more? Should it be
cooperation.
doubled, that pot of money?
Well, yeah, we're now back into what do we want? Everything. When do we want it now? That you can always say the government should spend more money. It's our money they're always spending, and this is the point. We've had a bit of discussion about how profit being used as a boo word. The reason. What you get if private companies make profits is that they can then generate the capital to make the big spending that otherwise would have to come directly out of taxpayers' pockets. It's a lesson that we are in danger of forgetting in this country.
You're looking sceptical, Ava.
Well, I don't know. The Caledonian Sleeper just got renationalised and people are pretty happy with that. And if you look round to the home counties, I can mainly speak to the home counties in London because that's where I live. I do apologise. But, you know, if you look at South Western Railway, they were turning over hundreds of millions of pounds worth of profits. For some reason, in the last couple of years, they've upped their fares and they've taken certain services out of action. Why are you continuing to make profit but also reducing the service? I
mean, the reason why some services have gone is straightforwardly that the passenger usage post-pandemic has only got back to about 80% of its previous level. So it's a reaction to a market.
That service still needs to run for people to use, you know, for productivity. So at the moment, people are at home going, well, I don't know if I should go into the office because I'm not sure if I can get a train in or a train back. If there was a nationalised service that guaranteed that it was going to get you there, they might get on the train.
But why would a nationalised service necessarily be the idea that just because the government runs something, it will be better and more reliable?
Well, Japan manages to do it.
Flies in the face of all
Germany,
evidence.
Yeah. All sorts of.
I do think that post-COVID there seems to be a greater appetite for let the state get involved, and I wonder if that speaks to the idea that overall, certainly the perception was that we did badly at the beginning of the pandemic, but overall, maybe that people think that they were OK with a lot of the interventions. So it's almost like a long COVID symptom politically, where the answer to a lot of things is more state involvement. I think in this case, I think some more state involvement, but not complete.
Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson was quite keen on big state projects and state involvement, wasn't he?
Yeah, well, there's a difference between projects where you build something and day-to-day state involvement running services. That, I mean, clearly some things have to.
I mean,
have to
what
be run by
guarantee
the
is
state.
there, though, that the state can run it and will run it better?
I think you need to take a strategic approach. I think you need to be clear about where the market is not working for ordinary people. So in the 80s, we had these bus wars. I don't know if you remember, Damien, where a lot of buses said, well, I just want to cherry pick the most lucrative routes. And we've seen that played out over lots of other modes of transport too. So you need to figure out where will it make a difference to our economy, where is it an essential part of the infrastructure for our economy to grow and green, and then it is worth taking that into public ownership and control.
Right, well, let's take it to your constituency, because I understand there have been cuts in your constituency in Ashford in terms of the services, bus services being run. Who would you like to run them?
I don't think they'd be any better run.
You don't?
If they were run by someone else. I mean, and the services, and we've fought to save some of them necessary and succeeded, that actually a combination of Kent County Council and Stagecoach, who are the main bus company in Kent, have actually removed some of those cuts. But I think that the general...
Sorry, but with all due respect, you're saying that there were services cut, but you don't think anyone else could run the cut services better?
Well, not without paying more. It does come down to this. And the point that Francis has just made about the state running it is that there are always priorities. And if you get something like a health service backlog, and you have ministers deciding, if you have a nationalised industry saying, are we going to spend that extra 100 million on the health service or bus services, I can tell you now that bus services would start becoming threadbare and not subsidised.
But you can make choices, can't you?
But you have to make choices.
Tax
What we're
cuts for
saying...
the rich, to me, is not a priority. Investing in our buses...
Nobody's talked about tax cuts for the rich. That's just a piece of rhetoric.
A lot of Conservative MPs are saying precisely that they want to see more corporate welfare and more tax cuts for the rich.
We're going to change direction and talk about Jeff's book, or the sort of subject matter, The British Bloke Decoded, which tries broadly to explain the behaviour of Britain's husbands, dads and brothers. Now, it's quite a light-hearted book.
From banter to man flu, everything finally explained.
There you go. All right, good promotion. Men have obviously and arguably taken a lot of flack, rightly, in the past few years. Many people would say post #MeToo. Is this an attempt to rehabilitate the image of an average bloke?
Well, I suppose what I always thought was like that blokes are a subset species of men, and most blokes don't really have a huge amount of power in their own lives. They're sort of trying to be dependable, loving people for the people in their lives. They might not be the best at remembering important dates or even the names of their nephews and nieces, you know, like. But I think that it's an occasional rubbishness coming from a good place. So what I've tried to do in this book is just try to explain some of the more baffling behaviour of men, like, you know, the fact that we don't put on sun cream when we're on holiday, you know, maybe till the third day. It's easy to say, well, it's just bravado. And then I sort of thought about it more deeply, and I thought, well, actually, we don't put on lotions more generally. So the moment we're on a beach and you have to navigate that bit of your lower back...
It's because you're not used to doing it.
We're not match fit, Joe. That's the thing. And you think that might be the first time we've touched that bit of our back that year. So I was trying to take a lot of these areas where men's behaviour is confusing and say, is there something deeper? And I think that they're light-hearted subjects like that, but there's also, you know, like loneliness and what happens to male friendships as we age.
Well, and when it comes to the serious points, we might come back to the application of sun cream later on, but in the Times, this headline, Rishi Sunak urged to appoint Minister for Men, suggested by a Conservative MP. New role would champion issues such as reducing male suicide. Would that be something you'd be in favour of?
Well, what's interesting about that is the hostility it sometimes faces whenever it comes up. I saw a programme where there was like a feminist academic and a Lib Dem MP, and they were so hostile to this idea. And I thought, if you flipped those things, i.e. that it's the biggest cause of death for men under 50 is suicide, men are less likely to go to the doctors, you know, men are less likely to maintain friendships. If that was for women, we'd often look at, well, why is society making that happen? Whereas with men, the argument is often, why are they doing that to themselves? So I'm not, like, totally wedded to the idea, but the hostility towards the idea, I find it instructive.
Ava?
I think that it feeds into the culture a little bit, this Minister for Men argument. Like, in my mind, I think there should be a Minister for Mental Health, which should be all-encompassing. I mean, you've got something like 7 million children waiting for prescriptions for mental health at the moment. It's a crisis that's endemic throughout the country, not specific to men. And I think, you know, a lot of ministers kind of bandy this about to sort of, I'm sorry, but make an enemy out of women. I think not you, and I don't think your book is.
I don't know.
But I think Sunak.
I don't accept that. I don't think it is to make an enemy. If we looked at during COVID, men were literally more likely to die from COVID. And I don't really want to cast myself as a meninist or one of these guys from the manosphere, because that's not who I am. But I do find it interesting that sometimes the arguments tend to throw it back.
But who was doing all the work during COVID? You know, a lot of the time, if you looked into people's households, it was the women who were taking on the laundry, the school care, all of that.
But I'm not disputing any of that. What I'm saying that there are specific issues that men face that might warrant specific attention. I mean, literally, the biggest killer of men under 50 is suicide. That is an arresting statistic, and if that doesn't warrant specific attention, mental health is an umbrella issue.
I have to say that is also because women are unsuccessful. That is a lot of feeds into that statistic.
But it feels like, it just doesn't feel like you've got any space for this idea that men might have unique challenges that face them. And the problem is, even as I'm saying this, in my mind, it's like I've got out the violin, and I don't want to be.
Read the book.
I don't want to be this guy, because that's part of the problem. Is because you're encouraged at one level is men need to talk about their problems more, and then the moment you do it, you're like, all right, but not quite so often and not quite so loud. So like you say, the book is more light-hearted than that, but it certainly goes around these issues.
Francis?
I think it's about this issue. I've got a brother, a son, nephews. Paul Novak, one of my best mates, who's leading the TUC. When you look at masculinity, it sort of feels like boys are still brought up. You're not allowed to cry. You're not allowed to talk about your feelings. You've got to put on this bravado. And I think that has to change. But I also think that we have to change the fact that women still earn 15% less than men.
But no one's saying you can't do both.
No, exactly.
We can multitask.
Exactly.
Can you multitask?
Well, not me personally, obviously. But I'm saying that. But I don't think that those are reasons to not address these problems,
No, I agree.
Francis.
But most women experience sexual harassment.
I totally accept that. I don't understand why it's happening again with this conversation where I'm talking about the specific issues that men face, and you're quoting other issues which I do not contest on any level.
Here's a proposal.
I'm seeming very chippy now, aren't I? I didn't expect it.
Why don't you launch BASH, Blokes Against Sexual Harassment?
Well, I'm totally against sexual harassment, of course I am.
But do something to support women, stand by women who are facing that. In the way that women stand by men, you stand by women, and I think we could.
Well, it's I do think this discussion has already been interesting. I've mentioned the suicide stat several times, and we've ended up discussing other things which are completely valid, certainly in terms of my industry, and I understand why those discussions are live discussions. But the idea that we can't have both those discussions, I genuinely find that odd,
Nobody
Francis.
said we couldn't.
Is this discussion being squeezed out? Is there not enough space for this as well?
Well, it slightly feels, I'd rather agree with Jeff. I'm fascinated listening to this discussion that at the first hint of men saying maybe we need a bit of attention, it's women have been oppressed throughout the ages, which is true. But it must be the case that if there are specific male problems or problems that only affect men, then we should try and deal with them at the same time as dealing with the specific issues that affect women.
What would you task the Minister for Men was doing?
Ultimately bad for men too. Sexual harassment is ultimately bad for men too, and decent men need to stand up and say so. And I think we could have better lives together.
The problems in my industry. I'm happy to stand and say, that in comedy there are specific problems in and around this area.
Because there is a power imbalance.
But that's what, and I've had that discussion on my podcast and elsewhere. I'm happy to say that as many times as people want me to say it. But just in this small section of the show, I thought we were going to just mention about some of the specific problems that men face. Men were more likely to die from COVID. If that had been flipped, we would have looked at why is this? This is a tragedy. We'd have looked at all the underlying reasons. But it just wasn't really a discussion. And I'm just interested in why it wasn't a discussion.
Well, that'll be for the next show.
Yes, the book is more light-hearted than this discussion.
All right.
I just made that point.
That's all we have time for. But thank you to all of my guests, and I will be back tomorrow, of course, with Politics Live at 12:15. Bye-bye.